Welcome back to the Applied Change Management podcast, and if you're new here, thanks for joining us. I'm Rose. I've spent over a decade working in change management and implementation, and now I run Implementation Works, where everything we do is built around a practical, applied way of delivering change. Today I want to talk about something that sometimes doesn't get the focused attention it deserves, which is sustaining the change. Sustainment is one of the phases where change can lose traction if it isn't actively supported. In practice, lots of changes start getting vulnerable once delivery pressure reduces and the project team starts drifting away. If this is something you're seeing in your projects, you're not alone. It doesn't happen because people don't care or because the change was badly designed. It happens because sustainment is often where things quietly start to loosen if we don't pay attention to it. Change projects create focus, structure, and attention. There's usually a clear plan, clear ownership, and a sense of urgency while delivery or implementation is happening. The sustain phase starts when the project is coming to an end and beginning to transition into normal day-to-day conditions. It's the moment where responsibility shifts away from the project and into the organisation, and from implementation activities to activities that stabilise how work is actually carried out and reinforced. If that transition isn't managed deliberately, you can end up with drifts, workarounds, or inconsistent application, even when the change itself was well delivered. All that means is more work for you with a reduced team to deliver it. Projects are delivered because they're meant to bring value. That value might be improved efficiency, better outcomes, reduced risk, or just a better way of working overall. That value only exists if the change actually holds. If the new way of working slowly fades, adapts, or gets bypassed, the value that justified the project in the first place starts to reduce over time, which is why we need the sustain phase. It supports the return of investment on the project, and it creates a stable foundation for whatever change comes next, rather than having to rebuild from scratch every time, especially in the environment we have at the moment with constant change in organisations. From a change management perspective, sustainment's also where the impact of our work becomes very visible. Metrics that focus on the behaviour change are going to highlight whether our impacted group takes it all the way to routine work or not. When sustainment isn't managed deliberately, after a while, project teams often find themselves repeating work, like rerunning training or revisiting conversations they thought were already done. Quite often, people do revert to old ways of working, not because they rejected the change, but because the conditions supporting the new way of working aren't as strong or as clear as they were during delivery. Change fatigue and saturation are real contributors to people slipping back into old ways of working, especially when teams are trying to deliver day-to-day work alongside multiple changes. As we spoke about in our leadership support episodes, we need leaders to support the change all the way through, but during the sustain phase, a leadership gap can appear because sustainment is often seen as after the project, and by that point, leadership attention might already have moved on. Cultural barriers can get in the way as well. To be honest, in a lot of environments, you might not have a neat or immediate fix for culture in the time frame of a project, but you still need to recognise when culture is shaping what will and won't stick. Finally, strategic missteps can make sustainment harder, like when the change isn't set up in a way that fits how the work actually happens, or when priorities shift and the change doesn't feel anchored in what teams are being measured on anymore. You've probably experienced sustainment being seen as something that happens after the project instead of being part of the change timeline itself. That doesn't mean the change was wrong or poorly delivered. It just means we need to bring it to the forefront of the people's minds who can help us finalise the project properly. In applied change management, sustain is a defined phase, and just like all phases, it's got a very specific purpose. By the time a change enters the sustain phase, people already know what's changing and the new way of working is already live. So the focus of this phase is stability, not momentum. At this point in the project, a few things change quite noticeably in that there are fewer broadcasts, fewer formal meetings, and less visible governance. The project team is still there, but it's quieter. That doesn't mean that your role grows. One of the biggest mistakes I see in sustainment is change managers taking on responsibility that doesn't belong to them anymore. The sustain phase isn't about owning the change indefinitely. It's about making sure ownership is genuinely transferred and then checking it's holding. If you're still the person propping the change up, it'll feel more like a delayed handover than sustaining a change, and you'll need to speak with the project leadership to plan a proper transition to real sustainment and closure. As a change manager, you're not driving momentum or pushing activity anymore. You're watching what sticks when pressure reduces, and you're listening very carefully for what's working and what isn't and needs attention. One of the reasons the applied approach works well here is because it gets to the point quickly. It doesn't waste time on activities that aren't directly linked to the change people are now living in. Instead, we use key questions to get to the issue faster, the practical questions that surface what's sticking, what's being worked around, and what might be worked around soon. At this stage, the questions we're asking are very different from earlier in the project. We're not asking whether people understand the change because that's already been covered. We're asking things like, what's still working when people get busy? What are people quietly moving away from? And where are teams adapting the change just to get through the day? Those questions get us to the real issues very quickly, without assumptions and without blame. The key questions we ask give us insight into what parts of the change are already stable, early visibility on drift, workarounds or selective use, and it surfaces any part of the change that are fragile and need additional focus. Along with the questions, we use metrics to support us during this phase. The metrics need to focus on measurable behaviour applied to the change and the outcomes that the project will give. Not just is the system being used, but is the system being used in the right way to get the return on investment? Change metrics help us through implementation and during the sustain phase, because if we've got relevant metrics, then we can use them to understand not only if the change is being adopted, but where and how people might need some extra support to really implement it in their day-to-day. So the metrics give us direction. They tell us where we need to stay close and, just as importantly, where we can step back. If you can see that a behaviour is holding consistently, you don't need to over-support it. If you can see where it isn't sticking, you know exactly where to focus without making sustainment feel heavy or endless. Remember those change managers who take on the role of propping up the change long after they should that I mentioned earlier? The right metrics can help us avoid that difficult situation. A big part of sustainment in applied change management is continuing to support line managers through sustainment to business as usual. As you know, line managers reinforce expectations day to day. They're the ones people turn to when things don't quite make sense, and they're the ones who notice when behaviours start to drift. During the sustain phase, we make sure line managers are clear on what needs reinforcing, what needs challenging, and how the change fits into normal performance and delivery conversations. The way you work with line managers changes slightly here. There's less explaining and more sense checking using the key questions. You're listening for what they're reinforcing and for what they've stopped mentioning altogether. You stay in touch with them in a way that works for them and ask questions to identify what they're focusing on and what they're letting go. They can tell us who's trying to move away from or create shortcuts for when the teams get busy, which shows us where the new ways of working can be iterated on and improved for the impacted groups. It's really not about pushing the change harder here, but adapting the approach so struggling impacted groups get the support that they need. Asking the key questions to line managers gives us clarity on what is actually being sustained day to day, insight into leadership gaps without criticising leadership, and a clear lever for applied intervention during sustainment. Line managers are often a source of information on resistance. We find resistance to focus on understanding it, not quashing it. At this stage, resistance shows where the change doesn't quite work in practice. That information is incredibly valuable, and a lot of resistance we see during the sustain phase is logical resistance. If you need more information on the root causes and types of resistance, check out the episode from last week, Getting to the Roots of Resistance. Using the applied root of resistance approach helps us understand why behaviours are slipping or adapting, and what needs adjusting so that the change can stick in the real world. Then we can understand whether the resistance is logical, emotional, or sociological, and take the action we need to support our impacted group on to routine use. Sustainment is where those final points of friction are surfaced and resolved before they become the accepted way of working. We need to avoid any assumptions, which is why we have key focused questions to support the sustain phase. Using applied change management, we improve the sustain phase by including key questions that we use to shape activities and gain clear metrics focused on behaviour rather than just adoption. These clear metrics tell us whether the change management has been effective, and the questions tell us where and how we need to focus on activities or adjust existing ones. Those deliberate adjustments are normally just clarifying expectations, tightening role boundaries, or changing how something's reinforced. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to help the change settle properly into the way work really happens. Throughout the entirety of a project, you should ask yourself, if I stepped away from this change tomorrow, would it stick? This guides you either to the metrics and activities we've discussed or shows you that your work is done. Doing this has streamlined my work and given me time back that I want all change managers to have. Sustainment finishes when that support isn't needed anymore. When the change holds under pressure, line managers reinforce it naturally and no one needs reminding to work in the new way. At that point, the change isn't being managed anymore. It's just how things are done. That's the point where the change can genuinely be considered complete. If you'd like a checklist with some key questions we ask during the sustain phase, you can find them on our website at implementationworks.com. Thanks for watching or listening to the Applied Change Management podcast. Each week, I'll be giving more information on applied change management and discussing important topics within the sector. If you found this week's episode helpful, please follow, like, comment, and share it within your network. And come back to see me next week when we'll be getting into how to make metrics work for you. I'll be here every Thursday. See you then.